Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Ben Bidwell, who's Director of U.S. Customs at C.H. Robinson. And today we're going to talk about trade and tariffs, preparing for the year ahead. Now, we have a saying here in New England that if you don't like the weather, just wait a minute because it'll likely change. And, the same can probably be said for, trade and compliance and everything that's happened on the global trade front, especially over the past year. I mean, while the U.S.-China trade war and Brexit remain in the headlines, there's so many things that are continuously changing the global trade, landscape.
Right.
We have seen the biggest, so the question becomes, then, what have been some of the biggest changes that have happened over the past, 12 months? Where are we today with regards to U.S. and China, the U.S. and the EU, and Brexit, of course, which is in the headlines right now? And how should companies respond to these, developments and risks in the months and year ahead? Well, those are the questions we're going to, focus on in today's episode. And it's great to have Ben back with us to kind of share his insights and advice on this topic. So, Ben, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Adrian. Glad to be here. Thanks much for having me.
So Ben, you were on the program, I think almost exactly a year ago to discuss what was happening with trade and tariffs at the time. And like I just said, a lot has happened, over the past 12 months. As a way to get started, I mean, can you give us a summary of, the biggest developments this year, starting with U.S.-China, trade relations?
Absolutely. So Section 301 tariffs related to the U.S.-China trade war have undergone a lot of change since we last spoke. And not just really over the last year, but even over the last month or last few weeks. So currently we've got lists 1 through 3 that are at 25% additional tariff. Those were scheduled to increase to 30% on October 15th. Due to some positive trade talks between President Trump and President Xi, that was postponed. And so it's not necessarily off the table, but it is postponed. The two leaders were actually scheduled to meet in Chile mid-November. It was unfortunately announced that due to some violent protests this morning, Chile made the announcement that they're going to cancel those trade talks. And so really where that leaves the next meeting between the two leaders is a big question mark, but something that we're certainly going to keep an eye on. Now, since we've spoken last, we've introduced a new list, and that's list 4, which is really 2 lists, 4A and 4B. So 4A went into effect on September 1st at 15%, and list 4B is scheduled to go into effect December 15th at 15%. One of the things I think is interesting is if you take lists 1 through 4A, so all of those tariffs that are in place today, and look at that, that's 67% of U.S. imports from China. And if you look forward to December and include list 4B, we're looking at roughly 95% of U.S. imports from China that will have these additional 301 tariffs. So it's certainly a large number.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's why, so many companies across so many industries, have this as a, C-level priority and discussion, because it is impacting so many, different, so many different industries. And, the numbers are just so, so large.
Right.
So of course, U.S.-China tariffs, get a lot of attention, but we can't ignore at the same time what's happening between the U.S. and the European Union with regards to, trade and tariffs either. I mean, what are some of the highlights, or maybe I should say lowlights, from this past year?
Right. So a little background of this. The World Trade Organization was reviewing nearly 15 years worth of data and found that European Union aircraft subsidies violated WTO rules. So on October 2nd, the WTO authorized $7.5 billion worth of tariffs on U.S. imports from the EU. And so what the U.S. is doing is they're imposing a 10% tariff on new aircraft from France, Germany, Spain, and the UK, as well as a 25% tariff on specific goods, including wine, whiskey, dairy products. from various EU countries. And so those tariffs actually went into effect October 18th. As of yet, there have not been any retaliatory tariffs, but discussions between leadership of each region continue.
Yeah, no, I remember seeing that as well, and I think that, again, that's something that the EU is a very large trading bloc with the
Right.
US, and
Right.
if and when countries start deciding to put retaliatory tariffs on our products, remains to be seen. I guess it's a risk that's on the table that companies should be aware of, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And of course, I think I've compared Brexit to like this ongoing soap opera, where constant twists and turns, and and it's back in the news again, today,
Right.
and the latest deadline was supposed to be Halloween, which is tomorrow, but apparently it got pushed out again to the end of January.
Right.
So again, it just this can keeps getting kicked out, but. I mean, what are the ultimately what are the implications of Brexit, especially under a quote unquote no deal scenario? And is this something that just really affects European companies, or is this something that matters to U.S. companies too?
So, January 31st is fast approaching. And so whether that means a hard Brexit or an agreement between the EU and the UK, time will tell. Something that is very interesting is that the UK, there's an 80% chance, that's, I guess, a conservative number, that the UK is going to hold an election on December 12th. And that's going to essentially be a congressional election. So that's going to give a lot of insight as to what happens for January 31st. Is that an extension? Is there a hard Brexit? Does the new leadership within the UK agree to a deal that is proposed or that maybe will be proposed? And I think to your point, that ongoing saga, right? What's going to happen next? But I think, when you take a step back and look at some of the bigger stumbling blocks that are out there today, you've got really a few major points. And I think one is how to tackle the border situation between Northern Ireland and the Republic. That has certainly been a point of contention and discussion throughout. And then how to handle the issue of residency and work visas, which is something that the EU and the UK are trying to work out. The Guardian actually had a really interesting article recently regarding Rotterdam. And Rotterdam in the Netherlands, being the largest seaport in the EU, is trying to understand how will Brexit impact not just the EU, but Rotterdam, which sits outside of the UK. And whether it's a hard Brexit or some deal is made, there's going to be an influx of shipments that need to be dealt with in a different manner. And so, now you're going to be looking at a large increase in shipments and vessels that used to be looked at maybe as domestic. And now those are going to require customs documentation, customs processing. There are going to be more exams. And I think really the thing to highlight there is really a message to shippers. This affects much more than just trade between the UK in and out of the UK. This affects trade throughout the EU as a whole. Now, obviously to varying degrees, but certainly something that shippers need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I've heard similar types of things. Where now, if all of a sudden you've got customs requirements, paperwork requirements,
Right.
that has a ripple effect, into customs agencies. Obviously, has a ripple effect into the types of software that companies use. That right now they're using software to facilitate these transactions, and now all those software systems need to be updated or coded with whatever these yet to be determined customs requirements are, and so forth.
Right.
It's a big implication.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a good point when you think about the software side of things. just looking at how the U.S. Has had to deal with all of these tariff changes. That's constant code changing and updating, whether it's on the private trade side or from a U.S. Customs and Border Protection perspective. Those changes take time and they're not easy to put into place.
Right. Yeah. No, it's incredible when you start thinking about kind of just the big picture implications of all of this.
Right.
So with regards to that, I mean, how should companies then respond to these developments and risks? I mean, do they need to respond differently to what's happening between the U.S. and China versus what's happening between the U.S. and the EU?
I mean, certainly some of the strategies can work for both, but really it depends on a number of things: commodity, your shipping patterns, your supply chain, your sourcing. It's really, finding a tailored solution for your company, if there is one. So that's the caveat. One or more of these things may work, but none of them may work. We've talked about foreign trade zones a lot. That has been in the news, something that the trade is certainly talking a lot about. Foreign trade zones may work very well for certain commodities, especially if you're looking to utilize them from a duty deferment standpoint, right? You want to import product, you want to leave that product in an FTZ and take it out as you consume it or sell it. But when you look at some of these goods that are being taxed from the EU, you've got aircraft, you've got food stuff, not stuff that is necessarily going to be a good candidate to sit in an FTZ. And so that can certainly be a challenge. Not only that, FTZs don't get set up overnight. If you're ready to move and you make the decision today, I want to put an FTZ in my warehouse here, conservatively 4 to 6 months. And additional to that is the cost, which does need to be taken into account. There's some other potential solutions that can work, but again, it's not always a candidate. Do you change sourcing locations? Obviously, food stuff, you may be limited in options of where you can source that. Do you want to take another look at duty drawback? Do you import product and subsequently export a portion or all of that? And is duty drawback an option? Duty drawback may not have been favorable when you were paying 2 or 3% duty, but if you add an additional 10, 15, 25% to that, that may be more appealing today. First sale is another option. Again, if you're going to do some of these things, you really do need to be talking to your customs broker or your trade expert. And then last but not least, and this is the one that people don't want to hear, but consider plans to cover the cost of the tariff. It's real. It's not going away, or at least anytime soon. And that may be the position that you're in, at least in the interim, until you can find a solution that is going to make sense. One of the other things, I know, Adrian, we talked about this last time, but I can't put enough emphasis around it. It's bond sufficiency. With the additional duties that importers are having to pay now, there are constant issues with bond sufficiency in their customs bonds. And so you need a customs bond to import product. Typically, your bond is set at 10% of your estimated duties and taxes for the following year. If you've got a $50,000 bond today, which is the minimum continuous bond amount, and your taxes increase substantially, and you now find yourself needing a $300,000 or $400,000 bond, if you're not ahead of that, and you wait until you get a notice from customs saying, we are going to render your bond insufficient in 10 days or in 30 days, whatever that is. 30 days is certainly more appealing. But even at 30 days, now you need to work with a surety company to increase your bond to that amount. That poses an additional risk to the surety company. So they're not just going to hand out $300,000 and $400,000 bonds. They are going to want to look at your financials. They're going to possibly want collateral, whether that's in the form of a cash deposit, a letter of credit, etc. But most organizations aren't going to be able to turn those kinds of documents or letters of credit, things of that nature, turn those around in 5, 6 days. Navigating through these organizations does take time. And if your bond is rendered insufficient, your shipments are stuck. And so I can't stress enough to shippers and importers. Pay attention to your bond sufficiency. Communicate with your customs broker. Understand what your current saturation limits are and where your bond is at. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up again. I know that's something that we talked the last time, and there's something that was new to me. I really didn't know that. And, obviously, I assume that folks that are in the front lines of this are aware of that, but maybe they're not. So,
right.
or don't, in light of everything else they have to think about, this could be something that even if they know about it, might slip their mind just because they're focused on the day-to-day stuff. So that's a great point that you bring up. In terms of actions, I mean, I've seen a lot of different stories, or I've talked to a lot of different executives, where I know, over there in Europe, for example, with the original Brexit deadline, a lot of companies brought in, inventory ahead of time, and they filled up warehouses in anticipation that there was going to be a no deal and so forth. And then, the deadline got kicked out, and, they brought all this inventory in forward for nothing, if you will. So now what's happening is companies are afraid of doing that again, because they're like, well, it's just, what if it gets kicked? What if the deadline keeps getting kicked off again? And then, we don't have enough warehousing space to begin with to fill all this. So they kind of got burned the first time, and now they're even a little bit more cautious in terms of implementing that strategy in terms of bringing in, product ahead of time. And I was talking to a customer recently, a manufacturer that said, we're now trying to move more of our production to our Mexican facility, facility in Mexico, but that requires us investing capital to grow that manufacturing capacity. And number two, setting up distribution channels and carrier relationships and so forth to bring more product from Mexico into the U.S. So it's not something that's, a trivial thing to say, oh yeah, we'll just shift production down there, because that has the ripple effect of, well, it's capital, and there's now, finding carriers and setting up rates and, moving product through the U.S.-Mexico border and so on and so forth. So there are these, so many moving parts to all of this, depending on which strategy you take.
And I would say, none of these changes that we talked about or these, potential solutions happen overnight. The other one that I definitely don't want to miss is the exclusions. That's certainly been a big one. So it's important to take advantage of exclusion opportunities. U.S. companies importing from China can submit an exclusion request on lists 1 through 3. And I mean, these lists represent $250 billion worth of goods. So it's no small chunk. And you can apply for these exclusions through the USTR. Now, some interesting statistics that I want to share quickly. Just list 1 alone, there was over 10,000 exclusion requests submitted. Of those over 10,000, over 6,800 of those were denied. And so staggering numbers, somewhat daunting, but the same for list 2 and list 3. While the USTR has just started to scratch the surface on list 3, so we'll see what happens as far as approvals and what those numbers look like. And then with list 4 exclusions, those can be submitted to the USTR between October 31st and January 31st of next year. What's interesting is every time we talk about these dates and when exclusions can be submitted and when the tariffs go up or down, it can all change within a tweet. And so it's more important than ever to stay close to what's happening in the trade and the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point is what's the most frustrating thing for everybody, is that literally it can change with one single tweet, and everything that you've planned for and everything else can completely change by 180 degrees. So, Ben, we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. As a way to wrap up, as we head into 2020, I mean, what advice would you give to shippers to help them navigate successfully through whatever happens with trade and tariffs over the next year?
Right. I mean, certainly stay close to your customs broker and your trade compliance expert. Not every option is going to work for your company, And your unique supply chain requires tailored recommendations that are going to lead to solutions for your business. It also helps to work with a company like C.H. Robinson that offers customs brokerage, trade compliance, as well as air, ocean, and surface transportation. That way, when you do decide to make strategy changes, they can be seamlessly implemented across your supply chain.
Great. Well, I'm sure that if we have you back in the program in just 3 months' time, as opposed to a year's time, we'll have a lot more to talk about, and things will be completely different than they are today. That's just been the nature of this beast. Just like I said in my opening remarks, it's just like the weather here in New England. Just wait a minute and see what happens. But you've provided some great insights, great advice, at least to head us into the weeks and months ahead as we head into 2020. So Ben, as always, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure, Adrian.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand at the C.H. Robinson website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Ben, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.